So why don't you keep holding that? Let's see. Is your mic works?
No.
No. Okay. So you just keep holding this.
Okay.
And we'll improvise,
Yay.
which we're good at. A lot of great questions coming in. First, though, describe in your interactions with the healthcare system because of the death of your father, unfortunate death of your father. What person behaved most like a jazz musician, and which one behaved least like a jazz musician, if you could possibly use your metaphor for your own personal case there?
Yes, I think the first person who really comes to my mind right away are the nurses, who behaved much more like jazz musicians in their ability to be in that servant leadership role, to be able to empathize, connect the dots.
Are they drummers or are they horn players?
It depends.
Yeah.
And they're very agile. But they were really the ones who seemed to be at the front lines and be able to fill in the dots. Unfortunately, our specialist physicians were a little less agile. Not all of them, but or would not be the first ones I would think of when I think of the value that comes out of being able to behave improvisationally, as Frank Barrett has defined it.
This conference is about the collision between design thinking and a whole enterprise, healthcare. And you saw that on a small level with the experience of your father. How do you think, I mean, as someone who's really an outsider, where do you think creativity needs to be applied in the familiar places in the healthcare system that you interacted with?
Well, first of all, I think that, as I said earlier, it's not a schism between the creatives and the non-creatives. Scientists are incredibly creative, and Albert Einstein was very known for having landed on the side of intuition versus rationality. I think that a lot of it really starts with us shifting the shape of our structures. So much of this is the way systems are designed, which triggers a very different way of interacting with each other, which will trigger a very different way of behaving. So all of the examples we've been given, even last night with the business pitches, are really talking about inserting wedges of very different structures, very different business models that I think can cause co-creation between the patient, or will allow for co-creation between the patient and the physician, will allow for the patient-physician experience to be one of playing together, of provoking competence among each other, and acknowledging the competence that is there. So other examples that people have shared these past few days have been this word trust has come up a lot, where patients have begun to lose trust because of this inability of even being looked at as a human.
All right, a lot of questions coming in on Yorn, and I want to talk to you a little more, Nadine, about Natalie, about the question of how you extract from interview experiences data, that sort of, and how a scientist might evaluate that as well. But let's go through some of these questions here. Applause to Nadine Burke. Doctors started talking about obesity when it became relative to long-term health, diabetics, epidemic, time for healthcare to embrace ACEs as a health issue. That's just a shout out for you. For Natalie, you make the statement, stop acting like a soloist. That's great to say. But our system incentivizes and penalizes by a soloist structure, mentality, and measurement structure. Providers have the best intentions, but current policy makes it difficult to keep people from soloing. How do we influence the necessary change at a policy level, do you think?
Well, it is a systems problem, and it requires a redesign of the system. So let me take a step out of healthcare and talk about another system that's has a lot of challenges: higher education. So a tsunami has hit the business model of higher education. Our value proposition has been in our intellectual capital, in the faculty and the library. And Wikipedia, Khan Academy, YouTube have completely disrupted that value proposition. So one of the things we've done at Philadelphia University is we've tried to adapt by changing the system and the structure. And I work with colleagues who were very proud of being specialists in our particular area. We redesigned our university to be a university instead of consisting of 6 colleges to one consisting of 3 colleges. So we did a lot of integration. And so now I'm part of the faculty of DEC, the College of Design, Engineering, and Commerce. And what that means is I have to play very differently. I'm actually being incentivized to collaborate. I'm incentivized to teach my students how to be what we call T-shaped thinkers, having the depth of their specialization area, of their major, and the breadth that comes from learning design thinking, ethnographic research methods, and systems thinking. So we've tried to redesign a system. So I think that if you look at the entire system of healthcare and all the public policy things that have to be changed, it's a bit overwhelming. Going back to the value of prototyping, if there are small ways you can call an experiment, a pilot, to try to test out a very different way of working within a unit of your organization, when people start to see success, financial success, success in terms of patient response and the way people are showing up at work, it becomes contagious. There's no disputing the evidence of those better ways of working. So I would say it's less about getting overwhelmed and say, oh my gosh, this is a really overwhelming system, but what are small ways we can start to prototype and change the way we work? And that was just an example from higher ed.
Can I just add
Sure.
something that's particular to healthcare? I mean, as a physician, and particularly because I just took my recertification boards, I think much of medicine in particular is very protocolized, right? And that's done for reasons of patient safety. We know this. And so folks are trained to do things in a very particular way of doing things, and they're actually trained not to deviate from that. And I think that one of the interesting things when I was training as a resident at Stanford is even a change in the way that we, for example, that we think about things, or the way that we listen, or the way that we relate lessons from other fields into the work that we are doing. It doesn't necessarily mean that you change the clinical protocol, but it may change the way that you interact with your patient, right? And I think that your experience was probably pretty typical, which is oftentimes the more very specifically clinically specialized we are as so-called experts or whatever, we spend so much time focusing on one tiny piece of, that one receptor on that one part of the kidney, right? And I do think that there are ways, to introduce jazz, a little bit of jazz into medicine, but I think it's also helpful to do that within the context of that there are some very important frameworks that bring value, right? And they bring value in terms of patient safety, and they bring value in terms of getting to best outcomes. Just thinking about where the spaces are, particularly as we mentor other folks or as we interact with other clinicians. I think particularly in the training is a place where we can see opportunity.
Well, how did you do that in developing the screening for ACE? Because it took you 7 years.
Yes.
And you got it down to 2 minutes.
Yeah.
And you really had to deal with some cultural factors. I mean, you were definitely playing some jazz in figuring that out.
Yeah. Well, I'm a jazz musician. No, I'm not. I have no musical talent whatsoever. However, I do feel like, it's funny. I think that your statement that scientists are really creative, if there's one place where it's my deepest joy to express creativity, it's in the clinical work that we do. And it comes from I'm hip deep in the science of how adversity gets embedded biologically. And having that really, really kind of deep immersion really allows me to get playful a little bit. And in developing our clinical protocol, it took people talk about rapid cycle innovation, it took what started out as really slow cycle innovation and moved to rapid cycle innovation when we had greater capacity. But
Or was it people were just not responding, or you couldn't do, you were taking histories that took like 3 hours, or
Yes.
you were going into the details of each adverse
So
incident?
I started out asking patients, like, oh, have you experienced any of these? And yeah, it would be, you know, folks would become, as my mental health colleagues will sometimes say, uncontained. I would hear stories, you know, like, you know, my husband shot me, my child lays hand on me, I'll be damned if this baby's gonna lay hands on me. Like, just really kind of intense stuff. And I realized, okay, we're
It's a
getting,
lot of data.
we're getting the information. Can we get it another way, and can we design a system so that we get the information, we get the clinical piece that we need, and we can also provide the patient with the right structure and support.
But you also have to do that without signaling to the patient, I don't want to hear about your stories, right?
Amen to that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's why we moved to our de-identified screen, because it actually, when you ask the patient even just to say which ones, and let's be real, you got 15 minutes, right? You can't be like, oh, okay, well, your child experienced you know, physical abuse and there's domestic violence in your household. Thanks so much. Now let me look in your ears, right? Like, you just can't do that. So really, that was one piece of saying, okay, your number is a 2. We're, you know, we now recognize that this is associated with health and development problems over the lifetime. I have, you know, I want to introduce you to my colleague who can get into this with you deeper and provide you with support, right? And it's working, you know, it's working.
Well, that's a great story of sort of the inner application of creativity and, you know, improvisation in an area where there's all sorts of cultural pitfalls, to produce something that is absolutely meeting a protocol and dealing with something that is data-driven and scientifically valid. On the data question, Sonja, how come awareness of PTSD hasn't reduced the number of suicides in the military, or seems to be, we think that awareness is a great idea. Is the increase of suicides a reporting issue, or are we literally not addressing that problem?
So there are several questions in there. I'll start with just the data around suicide. So yeah, the data around suicide are notoriously incomplete, whether we're talking about the military or just the general population. Classifying cause of death and knowing whether something was intentional, an accident, suicide, is very hard to do. And even coroners sometimes make choices about how they record cause of death data that don't give the full story. So yeah, suicide data is hard to look at. It's actually somewhat, and I think in fact reinforces the point I was trying to make, it's somewhat of a fallacy to think that PTSD leads to suicide. So I'll start with that. Again, I think we've come such a long way with PTSD is a real thing and we need to take it seriously. It is in fact not the leading predictor of military service members killing themselves. In fact, when you look at those who have committed suicide or attempted suicide, it's for the most part not the people who have deployed who are committing suicide. Okay, so you would think, oh, now we've got a story that makes sense. People deploy, they see awful things, they might do things they feel regret for, their friends are killed, they come home, they don't readjust back into society, and so they kill themselves. That's actually not the most common trajectory for service members killing themselves. So in fact, it's a much more complex set of circumstances that leads people to get to the point of committing suicide.
How would you apply the T-shaped analysis that you described for your students at Philadelphia University in healthcare?
Some of us are talking about. Sorry. Some of us are talking about it. Thank you. As pie-shaped thing at 3.14. Blah blah blah.
Yeah.
Your question was how would we apply the
How does that sort of T-shape where you have the depth and, you know, how would that work in healthcare? Does that mean everybody knows everybody else's job, or what kind of ideas?
Well, I mean, let's just start with curiosity. I think that that's actually something that is underappreciated, and it's actually not something that it's a miss in how we're educating to cultivate curiosity so that you are very grounded in your specialization. But so much of becoming a better professional and an expert is in the way you craft a question, is in understanding the next question to ask and who to ask, of whom to ask it. And I think that it actually is requiring us to spread out a bit and to have the depth of the specialization that we've been trained with, but also a mindset of curiosity and being open to morphing what we're adding into our toolkit. That's certainly something I've had to do, and I welcome it. Maybe I have a background in anthropology, so I have a very different stance about that. But I think that if we begin to see that only makes us stronger, more grounded in our expertise, then it's not actually so hard a feat.
How do you balance the creativity of jazz and the high risks that can arise in medicine? You don't want the surgeon suddenly shifting into D flat.
Absolutely not. And let me also say that, and maybe I didn't stress this enough, in all creativity, if we look at in the arts specifically, there are protocols, to use your great language. In dance, there is a rigor and a robustness to the practice that no one sees by the time the dancers get to stage. There's a robustness for musicians in knowing chord progression and music theory and key structure. So there are those protocols. So I think the metaphor still stretches. And I get that playing the sax is not the same as having to do heart surgery, but if we can expand the way we're understanding that we have, and I think physicians are doing this, but maybe we're just not thinking in this way. Physicians have to be incredibly adaptive. They have to be able to think on their feet, understand what's in front of them, and given the boundaries, given the structure that they have to work with, the time, the environmental conditions, the tools that they have at hand, they have to then be able to treat and tap into their expertise. So I think the metaphor still applies.
Do you think the risks in medicine, and this comes from a question from our audience, do you think the risks in medicine enforce a kind of conservatism that physicians and healthcare professionals have to fight against?
Of course. I mean, every clinician, particularly those in the surgical specialties, are familiar with M&M rounds, morbidity and mortality, where you sit there and you walk step by step through if there was an adverse event. Why did it happen? How did it occur? Whose responsibility was it? Why wasn't there the check and balances? And I think that, of course, the structure of medicine in many ways prohibits a lot of improvisation. And I think that's why there need to be safe spaces to do that. I think the most improvisational I've ever been in my professional career, uncomfortably so, was when, after the earthquake in Haiti, we went down with a team, and there was, we were running a tent hospital in the streets of the demolished General Hospital in Port-au-Prince, and nothing worked, and people were dying left, right, and center. And so we got real creative real quick, right? And so I think that in those types of settings, you're forced to do that because you have such terrible outcomes. In modern healthcare, what we generally see, which is to the benefit of our population, is generally really good outcomes, and it's the result of centuries of iterating and figuring out how do we get to the best outcomes. So figuring out, okay, so what is the space where we can do some of this tinkering that is not, when my mom is the patient that's on the table, right? And I think that that's what academia provides, but it also is something that I think each of us as clinicians can figure out whatever our little space is to be able
Well, you can do it in the academy. You can do it on the streets of Haiti. Is what
Yeah.
you're saying?
Yeah, but I think, you know, I think the challenges are obviously way more in that sort of situation. But in general, in healthcare, things go wrong all the time, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you know, I have a friend who's an anesthesiologist, and she'll talk about, you know, well, here's what happened on the table today, and here's what I had to do. You know, I mean, so in medicine, in mental health care, you're having to improvise all the time. And so I think it's one of those things where, yes, you need to understand the protocols and you need to understand here is the standard way of doing something, but then you also need to understand the principles for what you're doing. So that then when something goes unexpectedly, you can apply those principles and find a meaningful way to go forward.
I think your comment, Sonja, also pulls back the veil and some of the mythology that us lay people might have about the practice of medicine, and I really appreciate that. But I'm seeing, this is a pattern, and it's a theme that we're seeing in so many fields. The expertise that we thought Wall Street had was completely blown open after 2008-09. So there's a
They got it back again though. They studied up. And,
yes.
yeah, everything's fine.
But I think maybe hopefully a lot of society is finally shifting to a much more humble stance, which quite frankly, if we are engaged in a creative practice, we are always humbled by the acknowledgement of how much we don't know, of how much we can learn from others, and maybe that's a good thing. And I was also wondering, Nadine, if in the M&M rounds, are physicians going through a type of PTSD to constantly see that over wave after wave after wave of death and suffering? How do physicians deal maybe with their own sort of PTSD?
Well, that relates to a question in here. Is there an adult component to the ACE brain impacts of adverse? Do adults have the same kinds of brain consequences, and doctors included?
Short answer, yes, but to a different extent, right? Because children's brains are forming and growing, the experience of adversity is a developmental insult that affects you have adversity that's incorporated into the brain architecture, and then the subsequent brain development kind of grows in that direction. And certainly the biological processes happen in a very similar way in adults. Adults' brains have less of certain types of plasticity, but there are certain types of neuroplasticity that are lifelong. So I would say yes, but to a different extent.
And you would expect that in particular neighborhoods where kids with adverse experiences grow up, that the adult brain structures would reflect the enhanced amygdala, for instance, the more easily triggered adrenal
Yeah. So I mean,
pathways.
A lot of what we see actually is a lot of the studies are done in adults. So a lot of what we see is, for example, some of the MRI studies of adults who experience adversity in childhood. If you go through your entire childhood and you have lots of protective buffering from healthy, well-regulated adults, and then you experience adversity later on, what we don't see as much of the changes in kind of MRI functioning of the brain. The structure and function of the brain. More what you see is that folks have kind of the more of the psychological reaction and response.
Classic PTSD kind of
yeah,
response.
exactly.
Yeah. You called for the demedicalization of pain. Respond, Dr. Burke. Do you think that's a good idea?
I think that to be fair, the context in which she was saying it was to get real that not everything is PTSD, and not everything is going to be treated according to X, Y, and Z protocol. And I think that that's very compatible with the experience that we're having, which is adversity is part of the human condition, and I actually agree that what we see is adaptation, right? And that adaptation can come with health risks, but it also, for many people, can come with some benefits, right? You know, some of the folks, dear friends of mine who have had high histories of adversity, and they have an extremely high stress tolerance. And those folks are running Fortune 500 companies, or they're super high-powered marketing executives and all of these different things. So we see that, and I believe strongly in being aware of what the full scope of it is, without, you know, judgment or negative characterization, but say, hey, you know what, these experiences, they come with some health risks, and those are real, but they're also part of life, and that's real, and we have to figure out how to integrate it.
All right, a couple of things. Is the ACE 2-minute questionnaire available for everyone to use? Is it published?
It is, yes. So we've made it available for clinicians to use. centerforyouthwellness.org. Go to the For Health Professionals tab and just put in your information and download it.
Are you writing a book?
How did you know that?
Well, someone here is asking for you to immediately write a book. So you should write a book. So it's good that you're already working on it.
Oh, thank you.
Great. So good.
Thank you.
A couple of other things in here. I love this one. For Nadine, can I come and intern with you this summer? Blown away by ACE diagnosis, never even knew this existed. I think it's one of the Auburn kids.
Well, thank you so much. I don't know if you all noticed, but I'm due to have a baby in February, and I believe in self-care, so I am taking a 6-month maternity leave, y'all.
How does information on adverse experiences for kids make its way through the social network, for lack of a better word, foster care system, et cetera, as the kids grow up? Is that data kept with the kids? Do foster parents know about that data? And do the treatments continue as the kids get older?
Not yet. That is what we believe should be happening. 2 years ago, I think it was 2 years ago, then Secretary of Health and Human Services, Kathleen Sebelius, sent a letter to all of the heads of Health and Human Services of each of the states saying adverse childhood experiences are a major health threat, particularly for children in the child welfare system, and to begin to try and look into how states can create systems that address the specific health needs of children exposed to ACEs. I don't know that they have immediately implemented that yet, but all of these things are coming down the pipeline. This is the movement, and this is why I believe that 20 years from now, we're going to be in a different place than where we are now.
If the developmental brain consequences for young kids due to adverse childhood experiences, if they're permanent, how do you intervene? Are your interventions designed to reverse the brain structural changes or something else?
So here's what's really cool is that when we look at things like, for example, how exposure to adversity gets under our skin, it changes to, one of the biggest ways is it changes to the way our DNA is read and transcribed. So DNA methylation is a big piece, and then also telomeres, which are the kind of the bumpers on the ends of our DNA. And both DNA methylation and telomere regulation is actually reversible, right? So the changes to the way that adversity affects our DNA is reversible. And the reason to intervene when kids are itty-bitty and to do routine screening is that kids have a tremendous amount of neuroplasticity. And you can actually rewire some of these neural circuits to be able to strengthen the areas of the brain that will support resilience.
How would you say the science and the different way of thinking about public health that you've come to understand in your work in San Francisco go together? I mean, because some of what you're talking about is very traditional science, but some of what you're talking about is like completely out of the box, viewing public health.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if it's totally out of the box public health. I mean, I really think about adversity as a root cause of lifelong health problems, very similar to the discovery of germ theory, right? It's this thing, it's invisible, it makes us sick. For a long time, we really didn't know about it, and so we were responding to things by saying, okay, people got sick in a town, let's go kill a cow and put his blood on the door, right? And it was like not really targeting the problem. And then we figured out, oh, hey, you know what? The illness is caused by microbes, and we could figure out, so we started out, okay, hand washing, that's the basic. And then we could develop antibiotics. Oh, that works too. And then, you know, as we got more research, we figured out vaccines. We are still in the hand washing stage of this public health crisis, but I think with the right investments, we will get down the road to the fourth generation cephalosporins, so to speak.
Do we eradicate trauma as a way of addressing the concerns of your work, or do we live with trauma?
I mean, I think that it would be utopian to think that we're ever going to get away from the experience of trauma. So I think there's some of that that's always going to be present. But yeah, can we talk about not just how to help these kids once something bad has happened to them, but can we talk about providing supports for parents to be able to parent more effectively and not abuse their children? Can we work on not just effective mental health treatments for rape survivors, which I can provide, but can we talk about not raping people? So yes, I think we need to focus on both of those things.
So not raping is a cure for rape trauma. Yeah. We discovered that. We figured it's 100% effective. Yeah.
It's a hypothesis
Yeah.
I have.
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. Well, we could certainly go on for another hour. I want to give you the last word here, Natalie, because again, the whole idea of transform is this collision of design thinking into a realm that isn't necessarily comfortable thinking that way, but as we've discovered in this discussion, people are comfortable thinking about it. Just what are your thoughts?
So I think design thinking is a tool. Design thinking, really simply put, is a problem-solving process. It is a lens, and it's a lens that hopefully will help us to be much more hyper-human-centered and focused on the person who's in front of us. So that last picture of my father, that wasn't a spreadsheet. That was a man, a father, a provider, a husband. And design thinking is a means to an end. And I will feel really good when I start to see it being incorporated into a lot of different methodologies, because it values being focused on the person, because empathy is prime. It values lateral thinking. It values prototyping and the half-baked idea before we need to invest millions of dollars, and testing it with the people we're trying to serve. And it values story, which both Nadine and Sonja, thank you, talked about, which are critical to breaking down that barrier of servant expert.
Was your dad a player?
He played the bass in the Air Force. He did. And we've restored his bass. It's a beautiful instrument.
All right. Well, that's on that thought, on that musical thought. Thank you very much.
Thank you.